For Module 4, we move to the topic of probability. It's a mathematical idea, and so we're going to do some calculations, and it may feel a little mathematical. But what you need to know is that probability plays an important role in statistics. It helps us determine the likelihood that we observe the data that we observe, right? We have certain assumptions about the world. We collect data, and then we have to analyze how likely would we see this type of data if our assumptions are true, right? Once we can answer questions like that, then we can do further analysis of our data and our statistics um, that we come to once we have all the data collected, like we've talked about in Module 1, and then do the analysis in Module 2 and 3 and so forth. So we start by talking about some basic terms in probability, right? The outcome, we collect some data, we get some information, we have these outcomes. And so a simple example of an outcome, right, is just this observation, the thing we see from the world, from our data, from our collection, from the activity we do. And to be very formal, we call that an experiment, even though it's not what you think, right? But we may say from an experiment, because we could be doing an experimental study too. Now, a quick example is the heads of tails are two possible outcomes when you flip a coin, right? And so the sample space, right, is of our activity or the experiment is the set of all possible outcomes. That's the sample space, right? The space that contains all the different results we can get. Almost like distribution, but since we're talking about probability, we use slightly different terminology. Rolling a die, like an example 2, has the outcomes or sample space of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. Those are all the possible outcomes. We use another word called an event, which is a combination of outcomes. So when we think about more than one outcome, we can kind of think about an event, kind of a combination of outcomes happening at the same time. Keep in mind that one outcome is also an event too, so sometimes it gets confusing. But in general, when we talk about an event, we're talking about multiple outcomes happening, a combination of them, but one outcome is also an event too. And so what we think about, right, with probability is this idea that the probability, we think about it in a mathematical way. It's the long-term relative frequency of an event. If we see some activity, how many times, how likely would that event occur in the long term if we saw it happen 100 times, 1,000 times? That's what we talk about probability, the long-term relative frequency of an event, right? Now, since we're talking about relative frequency, that means the probability of some event is always a value between 0 and 1. And so that's another thing, because we represent it as a fraction, a decimal, and then sometimes we turn it as a percentage, and then that would be a number between 0 and 100, right? What's the probability of rain tomorrow? 40%. Or someone may say 0.4 or 4 out of 10, right? So it depends on the language and how we're communicating. Now, we have other words that we use when talking about probability, such as impossible, unlikely, equally likely, likely, certain. And those words, in general, have an associated value with it. And you could see that on this list. But in statistics, what we really are interested in is if we're observing anything that's unusual, right? And so in statistics, we kind of have a standard. It's not always true, but in general, we say that an event is unusual, right? Or we observe some outcome that's unusual if it has a very low probability of occurring, which is then in our case less than 5%. So keep that in mind. We're going to be using that idea throughout the course, right? This idea of probabilities in determining if something is unusual.